Thank you for the invitation to be part of this masterclass. I'm happy to share with you for the next 20 minutes some thoughts on where we are regarding long-term cardiovascular outcome after preeclampsia. We have for ages been told that preeclampsia is a placental disease and the only cure is to deliver the mother and remove the placenta. And as obstetricians, we kind of believe our job is done when the mother is discharged from the hospital, and therefore very often the information we have about the pregnancy is lost. So it's not until quite recently that we have started to explore the link between pregnancy and diseases later in life, including the association between preeclampsia and cardiovascular disease. And one of the reasons why it has taken so long to establish this association is probably the fact that it is not always easy to link information in pregnancy to outcomes several years after. In the Nordic countries, we're very fortunate, as all newborns are given a personal identification number at birth, and that number follows each individual throughout life. And this number can be used as a key to merge data from the Nordic disease registers. So one of the first papers which described an association between preeclampsia and maternal mortality was from Norway. And they found a significant decrease in maternal survival after preterm preeclampsia. The paper from Norway was done 25 years ago, and since then a lot of papers have been published on the subject. Here's a sum up from a meta-analysis published in 2024, and it shows a twofold increase in cardiovascular death after preeclampsia. And Fiegel has also summed up that women with high blood pressure during pregnancy has a fourfold increased risk of high blood pressure later in life and a twofold increase in heart disease, stroke, and venous thromboembolism. So one can argue that this association between preeclampsia and cardiovascular disease later in life is very well documented now, and that the next steps would be to look into prediction and prevention. But I believe that before we can take these next big steps, I think that we need to take a step back and further investigate associations, exposures, and outcomes in even more detail. The association between preeclampsia and cardiovascular risk later in life, described in the current literature, is very often based on large data sets. And here the disease is defined using ICD-10 codes. But these codes are primarily given to women with end-stage disease, and at this stage these diseases are not preventable. So if we want to move forward with prediction and prevention, I believe we need to look more into what's happening to these women at an earlier stage in their life. Actually a stage which is closer to their pregnancy. At this stage it would be interesting to assess blood pressure, biomarkers, and cardiac imaging. So here is an example of two studies assessing disease signs at an early stage. These two papers are based on the same cohort of women from Denmark, and the case group consisted of 700 women aged 40 to 55 who had experienced preeclampsia. In the first paper to the left, these women were compared to 700 matched controls, and all women received a cardiac CT scan. And they found that the preeclamptic women shown here in the red bar had a significantly higher prevalence of early coronary atherosclerosis compared to the control group in blue. And also in the study shown to the right, based on exactly the same cohort of women, they found that women with a history of preeclampsia at an early stage in life had an increased risk of left ventricular hypertrophy, and that the association was even more pronounced in women with preterm preeclampsia. Another thing that we have to consider is that we as obstetricians, we know that preeclampsia is a syndrome, and it is possible that the different subtypes of preeclampsia are associated with different cardiovascular risk profiles. So a very classical example, this is a meta-analysis from 2021, and it shows clearly that the risk of cardiovascular events are higher after early preeclampsia compared to the late preeclampsia. Here are two studies which assess the risk of cardiovascular disease after preeclampsia in singletons and twin pregnancies. And very interestingly, women with preeclampsia in a twin pregnancy do not carry the same increased risk for long-term cardiovascular disease. In fact, in the study from Sweden to the right, they could not find an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in women with a history of preeclampsia in a twin pregnancy when they compared them to singleton pregnancies without preeclampsia. And finally, if we have to look into the big picture, I think it's also important to look more into the preconception period. Because some women may already have a genetic or cardiac predisposition to both preeclampsia and cardiovascular disease. So overall, there's still many unanswered questions and much remains to be explored before we can fully understand all the associations between preeclampsia and cardiovascular disease.
¿Te has comprado algo?
Encontré el micrófono que tanto a ti como a mí nos hará mucho más fácil crear contenido sin información.
Which includes several markers for preeclampsia. And some of these markers could potentially also serve as markers for cardiovascular disease. Now research will be therefore aimed to assess this possible association in a study, and I will show you some unpublished data.
Si también estás en este rollo de la creación del contenido, por supuesto estarás todo el tiempo.
We got the idea to evaluate if the Fetal Medicine Foundation first trimester preeclampsia risk estimate is associated with cardiovascular disease in women 5 years after
buscando cómo
pregnancy.
mejorar la calidad tanto del audio como el video, y es por eso
For this
que
study,
me
we
dio la
used
tarea
the
de hacer
PRECISE
tanto el
cohort, which
unboxing
was
como
collected
la
back in
prueba de este micrófono.
2019 to
Voy a
20
link a
at 6 centers
Tal
in
vez te
Denmark.
identifiques conmigo en que todo el
And
tiempo
in
estoy buscando
total, almost
micrófonos,
9,000 women
cámara,
had a first
iluminación
trimester
y
risk
todo el equipo
assessment for
posible para
preeclampsia
tener un buen
performed
contenido,
to
hacerlo
validate
de buena
screening
calidad,
in a
pero
Danish
de repente el
population.
bolsillo no nos permite a todos
And in this study,
invertirle
prevention
a
with
todo el
aspirin was not provided. We then linked the data on the women's preeclampsia risk estimate to our national patient registries with information on diagnosis of cardiovascular diseases. And we found that in the total cohort, 4.7% were registered with a cardiovascular disease diagnosis. But in the group of women with a high risk estimate for preeclampsia, this proportion was increased to 14.7%. The group with a low risk estimate had only a proportion of 3.7% with cardiovascular diseases registered. So maybe the Fetal Medicine Foundation preeclampsia risk algorithm can provide us with information about cardiovascular disease risk later in life. To the right is the Kaplan-Meier curve, and it shows a significant increased risk of not remaining free of disease in women with a high risk for preeclampsia in the first trimester of the pregnancy. Women with a low risk of developing preeclampsia was used as a reference group, and we found that the hazard ratio for getting a cardiovascular diagnosis was 2.5 in the high-risk group, and this was after adjusting for previous cardiovascular disease and development of preeclampsia in the current pregnancy. The FMF screening algorithm may serve to identify women with a pre-existing cardiovascular susceptibility, regardless of preeclampsia development. And here it's important to note again that in these data, we used ICD-10 codes, which reflect severe disease. So it would actually be interesting to evaluate the model's ability to predict also the milder stages of cardiovascular disease. But maybe some of the information that we collect systematically when we screen for preeclampsia can be included in the future prediction models. So we're moving very slowly from associations and into prediction. Still, there's a lot of work to do here, and I think that needs to be done in collaborations with the cardiologists. So they need to include female-specific and obstetric risk factors in their prediction models. And then just let us look into how far we are regarding prevention of cardiovascular disease in these women. This figure describes very well that we may have a window of opportunity for prevention in the period also referred to as the fourth trimester of pregnancy. This is an important period where the cardiac problems may be reversible. So actually, as listed here, there are obvious interventions such as optimized diet, increased exercise, blood pressure monitoring, and maybe some drug candidates, which, as far as I know, have not yet been further explored. I want to show you just one publication from the POP-HT trial. This study was performed in the UK, and it describes how self-monitoring and physician-guided antihypertensive medications provide better long-term blood pressure control among women with hypertension in pregnancy compared to usual care. So in the study they found that the diastolic blood pressure 9 months after pregnancy in the group who performed self-monitoring was significantly lower than in the diastolic pressure in the standard care group. So studies like this, they are time-consuming and costly, but they are needed to further explore how we can reduce early stages of cardiovascular problems.
¿Ya qué pasa? Buenos días. ¿Dónde la están viendo?
No, recién voy a empezar a hacer un chequeo.
Ah, todavía no se ha hecho ningún chequeo. Ya, echadita en la camilla.
Ya cuando...
Fecha de última regla. El 15 aquí. Descúbrete tu barriga. Bebé está en el día. Bien. Lo que voy a hacer es una ecografía genética para ver el riesgo de niños especiales. Niños especiales, el síndrome de HELLP. Voy a empezar con las medidas y a ver la placenta y el líquido. Desde la cabeza hasta el cópito, 7 centímetros para 13 semanas. La cabecita. Está saliendo 13 semanas, por ejemplo. Y lo reinicio. En promedio tienes un embarazo de 13 semanas, 2 días. Tu fecha de última regla no es segura. Mejor no la des.
Es que la patente era el mismo.
Sí. Si te pregunta tu fecha de última regla, no es nada segura. Bien, voy a ver los marcadores con un grito especial. El primero, negocio general. Entonces el perfil, la punta de la nariz, negocio corazón. Perfecto. Los marcadores el espesor del mundo. El espesor de la punta nunca debe ser más de 3. 1.8 está perfecto. En su cabecita se ven los dos hemisferios con las alitas de una mariposa. Eso me indica que está bien. Se ve su manito. Se mira los deditos de la mano. Completos. No, su manito. Con sus dedos completos. Ahí está. Puede aparecer una calavera. Está perfecto.